Hello, good evening, and a very warm welcome here to 5 by 15. And thank you all so much for joining us both tonight and I know on Catch Up Online. We had to delay this event because of the death of the Queen. So it was great that all our wonderful speakers could reformulate and get together tonight, and that also you could be here to join us. It's very, very good, wonderful 5 by 15 that you have ahead of you. We're going to be doing some traveling and some mind bending, as well as a lot of questioning. And along the way, we're going to discover some of the great women artists that have been totally ignored by history. We're going to tackle the climate crisis by way of a quiz. And we're going to learn that we might only have 60 harvests left in our soil. We're also going to hear about why Fire Island was such an important part of gay culture at the end of the 20th century, and indeed into this one as well. And we're going to be visiting the Weird and Curious Premonitions Bureau, which was a truly strange and extraordinary story about whether people are able to predict disasters. Now, I can't comment on that, but I can predict that you're going to have a really great time for the next hour and a bit when you listen to our 5 speakers. All the books that our speakers have recently written will be listed in the chat, so do get them from our bookstore, Newham Books, or from any good bookseller. But in the meantime, sit back and enjoy yourself and prepare to be entertained and amused and definitely well informed. Now, our first speaker tonight is no stranger to 5 by 15. It's the CEO of Compassion in World Farming, Philip Lymbery. He's a passionate advocate of animal rights, and the work that he has done with Compassion has really, really changed the living conditions of probably 2 to 3 billion animals on this earth. His first book was called Farmageddon, and that lifted the very ugly lid on the world of animal farming. Now he's back with a new book, which is called 60 Harvests Left. It's a wake-up call, is all I can say, a hell of a wake-up call to all of us about how we are not taking care of the land that we live on and the land that we depend on. So Philip, a big welcome back to you, and thank you so much for coming, and over to you.
Rosie, thank you so much for your very warm welcome, and delighted to be here amongst distinguished authors. And yes, the latest book that I'm here to talk about, 60 Harvests Left. Actually, the subtitle is the most important: How to Reach a Nature-Friendly Future. And to illustrate this evening, I'd like to just share a few slides. These are pictures that are taken during the writing of the book. 60 Harvests Left is all about the fact that we live in a finite world. And essentially, we as a society have been living as if in a perpetual summer of endless consumption, as if there are no barriers. But we're starting to see, with the talk of the climate crisis and the collapse of nature, health emergencies, we're starting to see the leaves of the trees around us going brown. We're moving into a societal autumn. And what 60 Harvests Left is about saying, look, now is the time for us to change direction, to avoid us getting into a perpetual winter. And to do that, let's look at some fantastic, life-affirming, beautiful solutions that are readily at hand that can help us to walk into this fantastic new spring. Now, before I get to those, I just want to explain. The picture that you're looking at is a picture of the farm on which I live. I live on a farm hamlet in West Sussex. It's not my farm. We have all of the view and none of the work. But I have a writing companion, and here he is, Duke, our rescue dog. And Duke and I wander the fields and woodlands in our area every day. And we're joined by our neighbours' 40 cows that are munching the pasture along the river valley here, just as nature intended. And it's beautiful to see. But I want to just begin this evening by recounting a particularly memorable moment, because where we live, living in the countryside, means that I can see the good and bad of farming all around. And on this particular day, Duke and I were out on our walk, and what we saw was a tractor pulling a plough. Nothing unusual about that. The tractor was ploughing a lonely furrow, and dust was rising and catching the sun, creating an aura. And it was a beautiful a beautiful spectacle that is a classic country scene. But do you know what? I thought, hang on, something's wrong. And when I looked, I could see that there was something missing. There were no birds following the plough. The plough went straight over our footpath, which meant I could get a bird's eye view of the soil as it was turned upside down. And I looked and stared at that soil just after the plough had been. And do you know what I saw? Nothing. Not a single worm or beetle or other bug trying to bustle back into their burrow. Their world just turned upside down. The soil had become sand. It was like walking on the moon. That field was being used to grow maize, so corn, which is a common animal feed. And it was being grown using chemical pesticides and fertilizers. And so the fertility had dissipated, had just disappeared. And no wonder then that when the rain and the wind comes, the soil of that field was disappearing too, becoming silt in our local rivers. And it reminded me of cornfields that I'd seen, maize fields in Nebraska, in the Midwest of America, the spiritual birthplace of factory farming. And there, what I remember seeing was that not only was there endless GM corn produced using chemical pesticides and fertilizers, but that much of that corn was being used to feed factory farmed animals, caged, crammed, and confined. I remember seeing a Nebraskan feedlot where hundreds of cows were standing in dusty paddocks, not a blade of grass in sight. And I remember thinking, these feedlots, because so many animals, must be really noisy. But it was eerily quiet. The only thing that broke the silence was the odd cough or wail from unhealthy animals. And they stood in the intense Nebraskan summer sun without any shade. No wonder then that they were jostling, trying to lie down into each other's shadow. Factory farming has become big business, not just in the US, but across the world. And here in the UK, despite government intentions to the better, we have seen factory farming continuing to spread. Since over the last 5 years, the number of mega farms, US scale mega farms, have increased by 1/3. We now have more than 1,000 US style mega farms where pigs, chickens, cows, and other animals are kept in confinement, fed on grain that is produced using these industrial methods that drive out wildlife. Here is a picture of a US feedlot. So this just gives you an idea of scale, 100,000 cows standing in one spot. What I've come to realize is that because of the way that we're now treating the land, the way that we're now farming in an industrial way, change is inevitable. Why do I say this? Well, because factory farming has become the biggest cause of animal suffering on the planet. Unhappy animals living in unhealthy conditions means a great rise in disease. No wonder then that 3/4 of the world's antibiotics are fed to farmed animals, mainly to ward off the inevitable disease. At the same time, wildlife on farmland is declining. If you've got large fields, big fields that are soaked in chemicals, artificial fertilizers, no habitat, the wildlife disappears. And the UN warns that if we carry on farming as we are, then we could have just 60 harvests left in the world's soils. What that means is within 60 years, there could be no soil and therefore no food. Game over. Change is inevitable. But what does change look like? And here is where we look at spring, what the spring for our society could look like. And the first way that we can reverse the declines is through regenerating the countryside. And what this means is bring farmed animals back out of those factory farms in fewer numbers and have them moving around the farm in mixed rotational systems where they're able to fertilize the soil naturally, where you don't need the chemical pesticides and fertilizers. The other aspect is let's rethink protein. At the moment, as a global society, we're eating too much meat and dairy from animal sources. So what I would suggest is that we can all seize the power of our plate by eating more plants and less and better meat and milk. And what I mean by that, what I mean by better, is animal sourced foods that come from animals that are given a decent life on regenerative, nature-friendly farms, looking for pasture-fed, free-range or organic. These are labels to aspire to. And the third of what I see as the 3 R's to help us get to this spring-like new phase in humanity's future is rewilding, not least rewilding the soil. And here, what I would suggest is that we should be bringing back the elephant. Bring back the elephant to the UK, to Europe, to the USA, across the world. And actually here, I'm not literally talking about big animals with long floppy ears and a trunk. What I'm saying is that we should bring back the elephant's weight of biodiversity that should be under each football pitch sized portion of healthy arable soil. Each football pitch patch of soil should have 4 million worms, 13,000 species, rich biodiversity that we bring back by bringing animals back to the land, far fewer of them, in balance, in a nature-friendly farming system. And this way we can move forward to a new dawn for agriculture, for farming in this country. And in so doing, we're going to need to embrace these new ways of doing things. And it's so important that governments get behind it, that things like the Environmental Land Management Scheme that the UK government has agreed to stays in place, that we hatch new and very special ways of creating our food. It won't always be easy. Sometimes it'll be a little bit gawky, a little bit difficult. But if we persist, then what we will see is a return to nature in all of its splendor, not just in the UK, but across the world. And here, Rosie, if I may, I'd like to show you just a 2-minute film to conclude. ladies and gentlemen, let's seize the future. Let's walk into that new spring through regenerating the countryside, rethinking our protein, and rewilding the soil. In this way, we can create a better world for animals, people, and the planet, and save the future for our children. Thank you so much.
Philip, thank you very, very much. That was a really both incredibly interesting and incredibly moving talk, and I absolutely loved that film. There's something that makes you feel so awful when you see sires in farrowing crates like that. It just is heartbreaking. But as you say, and as you conclude in that film, we can change it, and there are mechanisms, and the right stuff is in place. We just have to push through. So thank you very, very much indeed for joining us. Now we're off in another direction, but also to a sort of endangered species, which is to ask about why the world has had so few big women artists. And the person who's going to tell us all about this is our next speaker, Katy Hessel, who's just written an absolutely magnificent and very intriguing book called The Story of Art Without Men. Katy's an art historian and a broadcaster who's dedicated most of her working life to celebrating women artists. And she founded an Instagram account called The Great Women Artists. She has 300,000 followers, as well as a podcast of the same name, which is listened to by 1.5 million listeners. It's great to have you here, and really many congratulations on the book. I know you've got some fascinating slides to show us as well, so the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Rosie. And what a fantastic talk before as well, Philip. Thank you so much. Yes, I'm just going to share my screen. Here we go. Fantastic. So as Rosie said, my name is Katy Hessel. I'm an art historian and the founder of an Instagram account called The Great Women Artists, which celebrates female artists on a daily basis, ranging from young graduates to old masters. To tell you a bit of background about the account, I started it 7 years ago in October 2015, after I had been studying the work of an artist called Alice Neel. She was an American portrait artist whose life ran almost concurrently with the 20th century, and never discriminating, she painted people ranging from Andy Warhol to her landlord's son, Benjamin. But it was the first time I really thought about the underrepresentation of women artists. I was at university at the time, and how Neel not only fought to be a portrait painter amongst those working in post-war New York City, when abstract expressionism was all the rage, but a woman in a man's world. Alice was also the painter of the late and great feminist art historian Linda Nochlin, who's pictured here with her daughter Daisy, who penned the essay, "Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists?" which really kick-started the feminist art movement in 1971, and is obviously the name that my blog cites. But my idea for the account really came to an existence after visiting an art fair 7 years ago, almost the day, when I realized that out of all the works in front of me, not a single one was by a woman. But then I asked myself a series of questions. Could I name 20 women artists off the top of my head? Could I name 10 pre-1950, any pre-1850? The answer was no. Had I essentially been studying and looking at art history from a male perspective? The answer was yes. I was shocked, and I thought that starting an Instagram-based blog, like any millennial art historian, would challenge me to find a different woman artist every day, but also put my knowledge to good use and tell the stories about these artists who are so extraordinary. Because after all, they weren't in galleries, they weren't in museums, they weren't in the history books, yet women have been artists for centuries. But the night of the art fair, I couldn't sleep. Frustrated about what I just witnessed, I typed the words women artists into Instagram and nothing appeared. So my blog was born. Adopting an accessible style, my aim was then, as it is now, to appeal to anyone of any art historical level. I don't mind if you've never even stepped inside a museum or gallery. It's about embracing the subject and giving it access to the masses. But it's not that I believe there to be anything inherently different about work created by artists of any particular gender. It's more that society and its gatekeepers have always prioritized one group. Because when the statistics remain so shocking, it is vital for this to be addressed and challenged. Because if I asked you in the audience today who you thought the names who defined the canon were, I'm sure many of you would recognize those images that we see on our screen. Botticelli, Van Gogh, Pollock, and Warhol. But what if I asked you these names? How many of these names would you recognize? Gentileschi, Krasner, Asawa, Kollwitz, Gluck. If I hadn't actively been studying women artists for the last 7 years, I doubt I would know more than a fraction of these names. Because still in 2022, just 1% of the London's National Gallery's collection is made up of women. London's Royal Academy, the institution, are yet to host a solo exhibition by a woman in their main space. And of course, when we look at the monetary value we place on women in society, it comes as no surprise with the gender pay gap that the highest price fetched at auction by a living woman artist has gone for just 12% of the highest price of a man at auction. And of course, the so-called introductory Bible to art history, Gombrich's The Story of Art, a book I grew up reading and loving at the time. I still do. It's a wonderful book, but it has one very significant flaw. It failed to mention in its first edition in 1950 a single woman. And only in its 16th revised edition, did it include one woman. That was Käthe Kollwitz from the German Expressionism. So when the story of art is essentially the story of art without women, I thought I'd write the story of art without men. Now, this is not a definitive history. It would be an impossible task, but I'm looking to break down the canon I have so often been confronted by. The canon of art history is global, but when the male Western canon narrative is so unjustly dominant at the expense of others, it is this that I unpack and challenge, beginning in the 1500s and ending with those who are defining the 2020s. This book is divided into 5 parts, which each focus on significant shifts or moments in art history. To avoid artists ever being seen as the wife of, the sister of, the muse of, the daughter of. For example, why, when we go and see a Dora Maar exhibition at Tate Modern, does Picasso's paintings have to fill so much of it? Because of this, I have situated women artists within their social and political context in the time in which they lived. While I have grouped artists within established movements for the purpose of clarity, I'm keenly aware that artists are not the products of categories, but rather individuals with varied careers who spearheaded key changes in styles. Because who were the women of the Baroque, Impressionism, Abstract Expressionism, working in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and defining contemporary art today? What is this? My 500-page book, which appears in all of it. So to give you a sort of whistle-stop tour, I'd like to introduce you to 3 must-know artists from across history who feature in my book, starting with one of my favorites, Artemisia Gentileschi. I'll have you know she was the first historic artist the National Gallery ever staged a solo exhibition of, and that was as recently as 2020. Gentileschi appears in part 1 of the book, paving the way 1500 to 1900. Beginning in the Renaissance, in this part, we explore the triumphant artists who took on large-scale commissions, pioneered photography, worked in quilt making, scientific advancements, etc. Because unlike Gombrich, I also want to deconstruct the canon by including multiple art forms and to not put any hierarchy between the art forms, because being an artist and a woman has never been easy. And in the 16th and 17th centuries, when leading male artists were sort of tackling 5-meter high marble sculptures and painting entire chapels in fresco, women, and were often termed virtuosi, women by simple virtue of their gender received no such thing. As time progressed, attitudes did not. It took until the 1890s for women, especially in Britain, to be admitted to the light where they could study the nude from life. Because until that point, the role of women in the history of art had been at best a curiosity. During the Victorian age, dealers were actually known to scratch out a woman artist's name and replace it with her male contemporary. It took until the 20th century, many until actually the 21st century, for them to be recognized by art historians. And this was the case with Artemisia Gentileschi. So Gentileschi was born in 1593. She was associated with the Baroque movement, most active at the cusp of the 17th century, that recalled biblical tales infused with theatricality, stunning light effects, and often blood-ridden and psychological scenes. In her lifetime, she became an international celebrity, but she also had the advantage of being raised in an artistic family, growing up in her father's studio in Rome, meaning she could copy from paintings and have access to pigments. Many women artists pre-20th centuries were the daughters of artists as a result. Gentileschi signed and dated her first known work when she was just 17. It is this work on the left of the screen, Susanna and the Elders from 1610, a towering work consumed with drama, which recalls the tale of the young, virtuous Susanna bathing in her garden when two lecherous men try and seduce her. I don't know about you, but when I see this painting, I'm filled with sort of anguish and discomfort. The artist, she captures that tense moment when Susanna is shielding her body away from the intruders. But the thing is, the Susanna subject was popular for the time because it was a way, an excuse for the semi-nude Susanna. But unlike so many male artists who depicted Susanna in this more sexualized male gaze, what Artemisia did, she almost gives insight into what life was like for a woman in 17th century Rome. But life for Gentileschi was not easy. In 1611, when working in her father's studio, she was raped by Agostino Tassi, an artist friend of her father, something that resulted in an excruciating 7-month trial where she was forced to prove her innocence. Despite a guilty verdict after being protected by the Pope, Tassi avoided punishment and Gentileschi moved to Florence. But it was here where she thrived, creating her best and most powerful work. This is seen in her triumphant and vivid portrayals of Judith slaying Holofernes. Artemisia Gentileschi was a fantastic storyteller and actually shifts the story, which in the original story had Judith had her maidservant keeping watch. But what we see here in this fantastic work from 1620, she painted it once in 1612 and 1620, is actually these two women working together, almost butchering this man's neck like a piece of meat. I mean, it's just visceral and amazing. The next artist I want to spotlight is Lee Krasner. She features in part 3 of the book, Post-War Women, which began in 1945. Because after the devastation of the Second World War, the question becomes, what is the role of art? What is the role of an artist? And how could the visual form be used to make sense of this time? Because how could art help process the horrors endured during the Holocaust or the bombing of Hiroshima? Because if the post-war years were about rebuilding, then the arts were in dire need of rethinking too. Artists of this era were faced with incomprehensible. They dismantled representation and turned to abstract forms. They filled their canvases with swathes of movements of expression, but also with the minimalists, pared it back to its most minimal. They revolutionized not what just art could look like, but art and their interaction with it too, with the birth of performance art. This period was really experimentalism at its greatest. So in this section, we begin with the abstract expressionists and Lee Krasner. Ambitious, bold, full of action and gesture, abstract expressionism is a term loosely applied to artists working in downtown New York City in the 1940s and 50s, a movement that marked the entry point to America's avant-garde. Lee Krasner was born in 1908 in Brooklyn to a working class Orthodox family, and she was formidably independent and outspoken. But like so many of her contemporaries, Krasner had the breakthrough moment when MoMA, formerly known as the Modern, opened in 1929, because you've got to think, these kids had never even traveled to Europe, and to see and witness the French modernists in the flesh, as opposed to seeing them in these tiny black and white reproductions, was extraordinary, and the impact was vast. After being confined to the smaller spare bedroom when married to her famous male artist husband, Jackson Pollock, it was actually after his death that Krasner was able to move into his barn, as we see this fantastic picture here. And it was here that she was able to thrive, making work that was momentous, vast. You can feel almost these sort of somersaulting shapes of her body rolling around in this canvas. But her emotions can be felt through the pressure of this brush. And actually in the eye as the first circle, this work is from her umber paintings, which is when she was forced to work under artificial light because she suffered from insomnia. So to refrain from using color, she actually worked in this umber tone. And actually what we see here is this, she gives life to expression and movement. In 1965, she had her first major retrospective at London's Whitechapel Gallery, and in 1984 was honoured with a solo exhibition at MoMA, but died 6 months before the opening. Leaving an incredible legacy and a formidable energy, Krasner embodied the liberal woman. She said, "I was a woman, Jewish, a widow, and a damn good painter, thank you, and a little too independent." Now let's head to Britain in the later 20th century. In this section, we look at part 4. Fueled by the activism of the 1970s, this era marked a revolutionary time for women. Protesting their outrageous treatment at the establishment, women responded by coming together, campaigning for their rights and actuating change. Forming feminist-focused educational programs and staging all-women exhibitions, women artists expanded ideas around conceptualism and performance art, while simultaneously dismantling the traditional art spaces. For example, they took their work to the public space or to the land, as opposed to these patriarchal or these museums embedded in patriarchy. The monumental progress they made during this time in the 1970s and 80s made a lasting impact that not only propelled them into mainstream recognition, but forced the white male art establishment to sit up and listen. Because after all, the Guerrilla Girls, the New York-based art feminist-focused activist artist collective, asked in 1989, do women have to be naked to get into the Met Museum? Because, as we see here, less than 5% of the artists in the modern art sections are women, but 85% of the nudes are female. But over in Britain, with rising unemployment rates, the destruction of union, the premiership of Margaret Thatcher, and a growing right-wing conservatism, a group of young, defiant artists exploded onto the British art scene, who would be collectively come to be known as the Black Arts Movement. And spearheading this was Lubena Hamid. Training as a theatre designer in the 1970s, drawn to the medium for its power in her words to make revolutionary statements and multi-layered performances, she also uses theatre design and that kind of set-like atmosphere to disrupt white-walled gallery spaces. From the very start, Hamid's art has sparked conversations about identity and hidden histories. Some of Hamid's best-known works are her communities of freestanding, painted, collaged, life-size cutouts. Taking a swipe at the bigoted politicians of Thatcher's government, Hamid constructed A Fashionable Marriage in 1986, a brilliant satire of the leaders of the day, directly influenced by William Hogarth's A Fashionable Marriage and his caricatural portrayals of the 18th century aristocracy. And here we can see her presenting Margaret Thatcher as the reprehensible countess. Despite Lubena's triumphant work and timely work, it took until 2017 for her to be awarded as the first and only woman of colour and first person over 50 of the Turner Prize. But despite the progress made in recent years, we still have a long way to go. After all, when the Guerrilla Girls revisited their Met Museum stats in 2012, they found out that less than 4% of the artists in the modern art sections are women, but 76% of the nudes are female. Thank you very much.
Katy, that was absolutely wonderful. I can't wait to read your book. There are so many stories in there, and it's so culturally significant that there were no women artists. I mean, no wonder women had such a tough time ever feeling good about themselves if you weren't allowed into this august community. It's fantastic what you've done, and it's amazing that it's taken so long for someone to come along and do your job, but I'm glad it's you, and thank you so much for sharing it with us. Now we're off somewhere completely different. Our next speaker is Jack Parlett, who some of you may recognize as an occasional host here at 5x15, but Jack is basically a writer, and he's written a wonderful book about Fire Island, the American island, and it's called Fire Island: Love, Loss and Liberation in an American Paradise. And it was published in the UK and the US this year to huge critical acclaim. All of Jack's research focuses on 20th and 21st century American literature, with an emphasis on queer writing and all the big questions about gender. Fire Island itself was the center of so much of this culture, a site of riotous hedonism, wild creativity, as well as immense loss, as I think you'll hear. So welcome, Jack, and thank you very much for coming and sharing this story with us tonight, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Rosie, and thank you to Daisy and Alex and to 5x15 for having me this evening. It's quite surreal to be giving a 5x15 myself. I've watched so many of them over the years and have been involved with things sort of on the other side. So it really is a unique pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk this evening about the history of a place, as Rosie said, called Fire Island. And that history offers us a story, I think, about fantasy, about the stakes of fantasy, and about the relationship between myth and reality. So for those of you that don't know much about it, Fire Island is a long, thin barrier island just off the coast of Long Island in New York. If you look at on a map, it sort of is like a sandbar. It's very long and thin. And it's located just off the south shore of Long Island. So it's right there on the fringes of the Atlantic. It feels when you're on it like you're sort of at the end of the world, but it's also only a couple of hours away from Manhattan. So it has this really particular quality of feeling very remote in one way, you know, a world away from the hustle and bustle of the city, but also being quite accessible. You can take a train to Brooklyn and from Brooklyn to Long Island and a ferry, and it takes a couple of hours. So it really is primed sort of topographically, geographically, as a desirable location for New Yorkers to go on their summer holidays. So Fire Island, as we know it today, dates back to the 19th century. And really it sort of coincides with the summer holiday and the development of a summer holiday as a sort of regular fixture in middle class urban life. And the search for somewhere to enjoy the benefits of clean air and water and to escape the dirt and disease of the city made it a very in-demand location. So today, across the length of it, there are approximately 17 or so communities, and these are mostly seasonal communities. So Fire Island really comes alive during the summer. Between May and September, that's when people who own houses on the island, perhaps their second homes, will open their houses in May and close them around now, actually, in sort of the end of September, early October, mid-October. But there are also, big groups of single people and friends who might rent shares in a house, which will entitle them to so many weekends. And there are also, of course, day trippers from the city and further afield. There aren't many people who live year round on Fire Island, 200 or so. You have to be quite hardy to live there in the winter. In the colder months, it's freezing, of course, and quite inhospitable. It's hard to get water across from the mainland because the pipes underneath the bay freeze over. So it really is a summer place. And throughout the 20th century, Fire Island has been synonymous really with two particular communities. When people outside of the New York area talk about Fire Island, they're probably referring to these two places. And they are communities that are roughly in the middle of the island, and they are perhaps the most famous. I would even go as far to say infamous. And they are the two communities known as offering a kind of queer haven. And they have done throughout the 20th century. They've offered a cultural hub and a safe space for members of the LGBTQ+ community from the city. So the first of these is a place called Cherry Grove. And in the early 20th century, Cherry Grove was known among families from Long Island as a sort of rustic outpost. There were, only a few houses, and it was mostly occupied by those families. It was very traditional in lots of ways. And it was in the late 1930s that gay men and women who worked in show business or in the cultural industries in the city discovered the cheap rents that were available there and started to make their summer home in this place. Things were fairly harmonious, but there were tensions between these two sects of the island community. The family people called these sort of urban invaders the theatre people, which feels like a euphemism that we don't have to sort of use our imaginations to imagine what they mean by that exactly. And you can still feel that quality in the place today, that it has a reputation as somewhere that's outrageous and zany and sort of bucks the trend. So it's known as a place, it's associated with drag shows and with a thriving theatrical culture. When you step off the ferry there today, you can expect to see huge rainbow flags and fairy lights, drag queens, go-go dancers. So that's in a nutshell what Cherry Grove feels like as a place. The other community to the east is a place known as Fire Island Pines. And this was developed in the 1950s, again, as a sort of family-friendly community. Although that aim wasn't really borne out for very long. So the Pines offers a slightly sleeker, more expensive alternative to Cherry Grove. If you think of the Pines, you think of Calvin Klein models, even Calvin Klein himself, he spent a lot of time there, and sort of grand modernist homes that look out onto the ocean with these, imposing Atlantic views. It was known even going into the 1970s, in the sort of post-Stonewall boom of gay liberation, it was still a more discreet option. It was a place for gay men who didn't want to be outed by their choice of destination, summer holiday destination to go. You could kind of hide away behind the glitziness of the Pines, although it would in the 1970s gain its reputation as this really hedonistic, absolutely buzzing space. And in some ways, the home of disco music. Many of the big disco DJs from the city refined their craft there, mixing together songs, creating extended mixes and mixtapes. And this is the thing about Fire Island, that it would be easy just to see it on the surface as this kind of hedonistic, glamorous place. But actually, it has a very long and illustrious history. There have been so many artists and writers who visited. I could spend my 15 minutes just reeling off a list of those names, but I won't do that. But people like James Baldwin have spent time there, writers like Patricia Highsmith, artists, singers and artists like Patti Smith, Robert Mapplethorpe, David Hockney, Derek Jarman visited from London in the 1970s. There's a really, really long list of people who've spent weeks there, weekends there, and have something to say about it, have recorded it in their diaries. And I'm sure there are many more that we don't actually perhaps know about, or that are harder to trace. Big showbiz figures like Madonna have been, known to appear on Fire Island as if out of nowhere. Lady Gaga performed there just as she was on the brink of international fame in 2008. And Liza Minnelli also visited, and that was known by sort of the locals as a kind of papal visit. People ran to the boardwalk to watch her get off the boat. I only knew about some of this the first time that I went to Fire Island. That was in the summer of 2017, so it was just over 5 years ago. And I was in my mid-20s and I was living in New York at the time, and I was working on my PhD project then about queer American poets, and in particular, how poets conceptualize the city as a space of intimacy. And I knew that the poet Frank O'Hara, who was, featured in my thesis and is still today my favorite poet, I knew that O'Hara had died after being involved in a fatal dune buggy accident on Fire Island in the 1960s. So I'd gone there in July 2017 with a friend who was visiting New York, and we began our evening in Cherry Grove, and it really did feel like a magical place. We arrived at one of the bars along the ocean front, and there was a drag queen performing a lip sync to Sweet Dreams Are Made of This. You couldn't make it up. It was one of those slightly stranger than fiction moments where the lyrics felt so apt. It was almost too on the nose. And it was deeply moving to be around other queer people, to feel entirely safe, and to feel that actually the potential for judgment or homophobic hostility had just been parked at the ferry dock. And we were somewhere that was created for people who share an affinity. After our trip to Cherry Grove, we moved further east along the island on the beach, going towards the Pines. I was looking to retrace the footsteps there of Frank O'Hara, who had composed elegies to James Dean on the beach there in the 1950s, some years before he would be involved in his fatal accident on the same beach, the same strip of sand in 1966. O'Hara had scrawled James Dean's name into the sand when he was writing these poems, and I was there to do the same. It felt like a slightly sort of morbid ritual, I suppose. So I was scrawling his name in the sand with my toe and looking out at the Atlantic, and I was reading from his poems too. And there was a line from his poem, Ode to Joy, that really resonated in that moment. We shall have everything we want, and there'll be no more dying. On the surface, it felt like Fire Island was exactly this kind of bountiful utopia where we can have everything we desire. It's a place where people have gone over the years in search of solace and safety and sexual freedom, freedom from violence and judgment. But it's also a haunted place, a place that knows death all too well. And I'm thinking not just of the ghosts of writers like O'Hara who had actually died on or around Fire Island, but of course the many gay men who had died from illnesses related to AIDS in the 1980s and 1990s. And that epidemic really decimated the communities of Cherry Grove and the Pines. The beach parties that made the Pines famous in the 70s still continued into this period, but it also became a funereal place. People would go there to scatter their ashes, the ashes of their lovers and friends. It felt to me in that moment like a haunted place, and it sparked, I guess, an obsession with a place that was quite hard to get a handle upon and felt unlike anywhere I'd ever been before. That's what made me want to write a book about this place. And I found my hunch about its hauntedness affirmed in its literary history. I found a poem by W.H. Auden, who'd briefly owned a house on Fire Island with friends in the late 1940s. And he wrote, this poem was called Pleasure Island, and Auden felt very ambivalent about pleasure. It's a slightly ironic title. But he wrote, it's as if the lenient, amusing shore knows in fact about all the dyings. It was almost eerie to read this line long before the ravages of the epidemic, finding in this textual history the sense of foreboding, the feeling that the landscape of the island itself might be sentient itself or timeless, kind of aware of the lives that were being lived there and the lives that it had claimed. Auden was rather ambivalent about Fire Island as a place, as I suggested. There are photos of him enjoying his kind of idyllic life there, a writer on retreat. But in reality, his literary celebrity from the city followed him there. He was often accosted by people in bars who wanted him to read their poems or their novel manuscripts and things like that. It was a chaotic time in his life. There were drunken conflicts with his lovers. He was extremely self-conscious about his body. And so the evidence that we have of his experience there feels disjointed from these images that feel idealized in some way. And this disjoint feels important, I think. It captures something central about Fire Island as a place. There are all kinds of charming untruths and counterfactual moments in the island's history, these moments where myth and reality don't seem to meet up. I so want to believe, as local law suggests, that Oscar Wilde visited Cherry Grove in the 1880s during his American lecture tour. But there's no primary evidence that suggests that's true. So we're left instead with the question as to why this myth endures and why it matters. I think there's something about that image of, Wilde, the aesthete, sort of christening the island shores like a gay, flamboyant patron saint that feels too appealing to ignore entirely. And while the myth of Fire Island offers a sort of idealized projection of the good life, and it's a common location on Instagram, and that's surely no accident here, I think, the reality is often far more complex. Many of the people that I interviewed for my book have been going to Fire Island for decades. They've made it their home. It's their happy place, their safe place. But they're also very aware of its problems. A place that might seem like a utopia to some has often been anything but, and a paradise that's inclusive only to a certain extent. It's been inhabited mostly through its history by white, affluent, cisgendered, able-bodied queer people. And there are important conversations today that are seeking to, help and progress the island's communities and make them more inclusive. So utopia is a complex idea. It's both real and abstract. It describes a place, but also an idea of a place. Fire Island's shortcomings as a utopia are self-evident, but I think its value is as a place that offers us an imperfect vision of paradise, which can tell us about ourselves and our desires. It's not just reality, after all, that informs our vision of the future. It's the radical ideals that we find forged in fantasies of a place where all of us have everything we want, and there'll be no more dying. Thank you for listening.
Jack, thank you so much. That was really fascinating. I didn't know that much about Fire Island, and clearly it's a place one should know about. What a lot of writers and extraordinary, important cultural things happened there. So thank you very much for sharing that, and good luck with the book. I'm so glad that it's out. Now, another change of direction. So do you know your biome from your biosphere, or do you know about the earth-saving power of fungi? Our next speaker knows the answers to all these things and a whole lot more. Lucy Siegle is probably the foremost environmental journalist in the UK. She writes regularly for The Observer. She appears on The One Show. She does all sorts of wonderful things. She began as someone who took apart the fashion industry and its really catastrophic footprint on the planet. And from there, she's branched out to cover so many other aspects. And now she's just published this wonderful book called Be the Ultimate Friend of the Earth, which is done as a 10 chapters with 10 questions in each. And I've been going through it and I'm not doing too badly, but I have to tell you all the answers, the questions are amazing, but the answers are truly wonderful. And it's a great book, and it's a great book to give your friends and to play with your friends. And Lucy, thank you very, very much for being here tonight to tell us about it. And as I say, the details of the book are in the chat. It's a great one to buy and it's a great present. So over to you.
Oh, Rosie, thank you. What an amazing introduction. That's so nice. I love 5x15 because I'm always so influenced by what's come before. And yeah, Jack, I'm just thinking now, I'm going to talk about the earth. I'm not going to be able to get some of your very resonant ideas out of my head. And I think, you know, a paradise that's inclusive to a point really is saying something about the biosphere as well at this point in time. Maybe not as much of a paradise as it once was. So as Rosie said, I elected to write a quiz book. And I should probably explain why I did that, because it might seem a bit odd, especially as my other work, I previously focused on very specific supply chains like fashion and textiles, as Rosie mentioned, and also plastic. Sadly, those two things have kind of converged recently, which maybe I'll come back to. So I wanted something that had some joy in it, because I think when we talk about our response to the nature and climate emergency, the dual crisis that we face, the existential crisis, you know, for obvious reasons, there's not that many laughs in it. It's also hard for people to drop in to this subject when we were all told to an extent that it either wasn't for us, we didn't have to worry about it, it was being overblown, it was a distraction, you know, all of these things up until the present day, you know, anti-growth coalition, etc., etc. So I never blame anyone for not being an early adopter of sustainability. And for many years, I suppose what I was trying to do was write about something that a lot of people were not that interested in, which meant knocking on a lot of doors and trying to convince commissioning editors in TV and in print and then online that this was something that was worthy, that we could make a story out of this, because it is actually the biggest story of our generations, and it is also the most interesting, as I will now try and attempt to explain. So I decided to do a quiz book, and there's the cover, and I wanted to really talk about our lives and how we live our lives. And, you know, I know that there is a massive debate in the environmental movement between system change or individual change. And quite often individual change is dismissed as something as, you know, it's obviously not going to do the numbers, it's a distraction, it's a delay tool. I don't really believe that. I think that individual change is really important, even as a gateway to understanding why we need system change. I think we need both. I don't think there is an equivalence between how important they are, but I think it's really important to meet people where they are. And as I sort of explained before, a lot of us had fairly sporadic or non-existent environmental education. I was personally very lucky because I went to a lot of schools. I went to 15 schools in the UK and Ireland, and I just happened to start my senior school when they were doing a bit of an experiment, and they had an environmental science teacher, and I did environmental science for 2 years at senior school. But I realized now that that was a little bit of an anomaly, and I loved it. It was so amazing. We used to learn about polar bears and Inuit people and the tundra, and you know, it just really fired up my imagination. But increasingly, I'm talking to people who are now expected to know about sustainability, either through their kids who are coming back with lots of questions and lots of diktats quite often, and also at work. So some people's jobs are now being increased so that they also have to cover, even if it's something like recycling. And what a lot of people feel, and I really have sympathy with this, they don't know how they're going to catch up. It's like you've missed a whole period of school and you're too embarrassed to ask the questions. So in a nutshell, that is why I wanted to do this book in this way. And I'm going to very quickly run through some of the chapters. And because the nature when you write a quiz is that you can't stop thinking of quiz questions, I will probably fire out some questions as well. Don't answer. I mean, you can shout them out on your own at home, that's fine, but there's no mechanism for answering these right now. It's just personal kudos is your prize. So they're not necessarily ones from the book either, because I don't want to spoil the book for you. I wanted to keep it very simple, because actually this is quite simple. No, it's not. It's extremely complex because Earth system dynamics are complex. But on one level, our role and our response is quite simple. What could we do? And the answer is that we could be a much better mate to the planet, because we understand, you know, humans are by and large quite good at being friends. They're quite good at building rapport, even if sometimes that's manipulative and you just want something. Once you realize where your bread is buttered, as it were, once you realize that you need to maintain these relationships, then we're quite good at doing that. And some people do it for completely altruistic reasons too. So the planet is ours, you know, it's our home. Nature is not separate from us. We are part of nature. We are just another species, which I think, you know, it's a good idea to remind ourselves now and again that we're not the only species, far from it. And I think once you sort of allow yourself to remember how dependent you are on planet Earth, then it becomes a very easy conceit. Just be a better friend. And what does that mean? It means prioritizing the Earth in the things that you do and say, and the services and products that you buy. You know, everything becomes invaded, if you like, or infested with this idea of prioritizing the Earth a little bit more than you do. Because at the moment, we're a pretty bad friend to the Earth, you know, numerous times a day. So really, if we can just reduce that down and be a better friend, then we will have a much better balance. So it starts with planet hype. And I really think that we should hype up the planet more, because it is kind of incredible and we are part of it and it's our home and we should be really proud of it. We also, there's a lot of bad news for obvious reasons, but we also know a lot more about the planet than we have ever done at any point in history. So Earth science has come on by leaps and bounds in the last 30 years, and that's really, really exciting. So it's a good time to sort of chip in, even if it's the first time. For example, here's a little question. So there's a caption that accompanies a picture of planet Earth, and the picture is from NASA. It's a view of the Earth as seen by the Apollo 17 crew traveling towards the moon. This translunar coast photograph extends from the Mediterranean Sea area to the Antarctic South Polar ice cap. It's the first time the Apollo trajectory made it possible to photograph the South Polar ice cap. Note the heavy cloud cover in the southern hemisphere. Almost the entire coastline of Africa is clearly visible. So this is a caption that accompanies a very beautiful picture that you will have seen. But what two-word phrase is this picture usually known by? The answer is blue marble, because it looks like a marble and it's mainly blue. We'll come back to that in a minute, because the ocean is often very undervalued. But that's kind of incredible. So we've all grown up knowing that picture, but that picture wasn't available to previous generations. We now know so much about the Earth, how it works, how the system works, how the biosphere works, and how the ecosystem works. So just on the biosphere, again, coming back to the complexity versus simplicity, the thing with the biosphere is it's not really that big when you think about it. So I think it's about 12 miles in its entirety, and that's from the deepest depths of the ocean to the highest point of the atmosphere that we know about. But really, most life exists in a smaller part of that. So 7 miles maximum, really. And we know these boundaries because we have things like submersibles now. So being able to go to the bottom of the Mariana Trench, and we've been able to see what life is there. And unfortunately, what we found there was a plastic bag. You may have seen those images. So we know we're polluting as well. That's the bad news. But we also know, like, we can estimate the top of the biosphere. And how do we do that? By the highest flying bird. That's how we base that, what we base that assumption. So that's 7 miles. That shouldn't be beyond the wit of human intelligence to stabilize those 7 miles. And we do need to stabilize them, don't we? Because this is another favorite question of mine. Conditions on planet Earth over the last 10,000 to 12,000 years are represented by a Greek word to describe this period, the Holocene. But due to environmental pressures caused by humans, by us, conditions have now changed, and many scientists now think we've entered a different epoch. What is this epoch called? So what replaces the Holocene? The answer is the Anthropocene. And Anthropocene, obviously anthro, and that means of humans. We have become a geological force in our own right because we've exerted so much pressure on the planetary boundaries. So that means taking resources at too fast a rate to be replenished and causing the 6th great mass extinction. So 2021, we lost more animals efficiently, more species, I should say. We lost 23 species. So these are species from mussels to plants, which have, haven't been seen since the 1980s. So at that point, we have to write them off. And this is obviously a really, really big pressure. And that's why I called my chapter, Don't Be Mean to the Holocene. So if we can focus our efforts on trying to get back to the Holocene, trying to recreate those stable conditions, and obviously a lot of that relates to climate change. And that's why we have the Global Climate Agreement and regime through the Paris Climate Agreement. And you hear lots of mention of 1.5 degrees. Looks like we're going to pass that. That's the spoiler. But every degree counts because we need to try and stabilize those global temperatures. So you see, this is all, it's not just a load of kind of mad, crazy sort of things that we've decided that everyone has to do. It's all directly related to how we know that the Earth systems work, which is why I really wanted to do this book. But it's cultural as well. And what we have to try and do is embed this thinking. So quite often throughout my career, I have talked about sustainable living, ethical living, and these lifestyle changes that you make. Now, obviously, in and of themselves, they are not going to be able to stabilize the climate. Like your next door neighbor buying an electric vehicle is not going to help that much, although they might feel much better about it. However, those collective actions are really important. And what's important about those is we understand why we are doing them. Because we have to start joining the dots between creating a different society, a different way of living. You often call it, hear it referred to as the green transition. So a transition away essentially from fossil fuels towards renewable energy, which underpins everything that we do. And once you take your foot off the gas, metaphorically and literally, other technologies and solutions start to become possible. And that's when we can see this great acceleration away from this wasteful, polluting existence that's actually driving us towards destruction, and not of the planet. The planet will be fine. So don't talk about saving the Earth. We've got to talk about saving ourselves. And that's what the mission is at this point. And it can seem really trivial to then go and start obsessing about things that you do in your own life. But I'm never scared of the trivial. So here's a little sort of a little starter for 10. What is this? What is this implement? I'll tell you what it is. It's called the Body Flick, and it came out around 2002, 2003. It was manufactured by a woman who lived in the Midlands. And unfortunately, they don't sell them anymore. I think I've got one of the last ones, but it is in the Design Museum in Paris. Now, this is the Body Flick, and it flicks off water. So when you're in the shower, you dry yourself with this Body Flick first, and then you don't have to use so many towels. Your towels will stay in circulation, which means you can reduce your energy consumption. And by the way, to wash, to launder and dry a towel costs £1 each time you do it. It's a very expensive process. And we are now living our lives as if we lived in a spa. So we wash and we launder and we want all of this kind of luxury. And these are the kind of pressures that we put on ourselves. And then that is manifest in our energy bill and so on and so on and so on and so on. So some of the book, I talk about these kind of shifts away from a society which is about overproduction to overconsumption to something that brings us back within the planetary boundaries. So I'm just trying to link everything that we do and all our sustainable advice that we dispense with how the ecosystem actually works. And at the end of the day, all that means is that you are being a better friend to the planet. And if you want to take that, if you're competitive, you want to become the ultimate friend of the earth. And there we are.
Lucy, thank you so much. As I said before, it's a wonderful book, and quizzes are so great, and there's such a great way to learn things. And yes, actually, I thought you were going to say that thing that flicks water off you was just another piece of useless plastic.
No, yeah. I love it.
No, I can see that now. Now I had to rethink my initial thinking. God, this is a very strange item.
This is the best use of plastic ever.
Okay, all right. Well, maybe you should start manufacturing it. Anyway, thank you so much for being with us. Our last speaker tonight, we're really pleased to have him with us, is Sam Knight, who works for The New Yorker. And he's also the author of this extraordinary book about the Premonitions Bureau, which, as I said at the beginning, is about people who can find out apparently what is going to happen in the future. But I would also like to mention that Sam, about 6 years ago, wrote a long read for The Guardian, which was called Operation London Bridge, which was about what happens when the monarch dies. And of course, in the course of the last month or so, this piece has been downloaded some 4 to 5 million times. And it's actually completely riveting about all the processes. And I think probably, Sam, you would agree that all the processes were followed almost to the letter, as you wrote about all those years ago. So some things never change. But anyway, over to you, and thank you so much for coming and sharing this amazing story with us.
Oh, well, thank you, and thank you so much for having me, and hello everybody, and kind of what wonderful talks already, I'll start talking away. I've written this book. It's called The Premonitions Bureau, and it came out earlier this year. And I thought what I'd do is just talk to you about some of the thoughts that sustained me while I was doing the research, and kind of since it's come out. They're just the things that have really stayed with me in a way, and they're all kind of in there, but I thought I'd just sort of tease them out a little bit. So the Royal Society is the world's oldest active scientific organization. It was founded in the 1660s with a motto, nullius in verba, to take nobody's word for it. And the idea of the Royal Society was that it was going to be a new way of describing the world through facts gained by experiment. And about 30 years into its existence, the Royal Society commissioned a young Scottish tutor called Martin Martin to map and describe life in the Western Isles of Scotland. And Martin's study, it's still in print, he chose to devote about 35 pages to the phenomenon of second sight. The Gaelic phrase for second sight is Andashella. It literally means two sights. You have one way of perceiving the world, which is logical and materialist and rational. And you have another way of perceiving the world, and that is one which is magical and which is unbounded by time or by reason. And in Martin's description, people who lived in the Hebrides in the 17th century would see phantom wedding processions coming through the fields, or a neighboring farmer would have an accident on the far side of the island, and people would see it and go to their side. Children would see the body of a relative laid out on the dining room table or on the sideboard, even while they were still among them. These visions were kind of sufficiently common that there were patterns to them. If a spark fell on your shoulder, it meant that your child would die. if you were in a lonely place and you heard the sound of music, it would mean that a church would be built there one day. When he was doing the study, Martin himself was often seen kind of hundreds of miles from where he was. And I thought about Martin a lot when I was researching my book, because the story of the Premonitions Bureau is also a story, a second sight. And Martin made two observations that really struck me. And one was that the people of the Hebrides, they weren't drunk, they weren't mad, they didn't describe this as a gift or a particular affliction. It was just part of their way of making sense of things. And they didn't believe every vision or dream or sense of foreboding that they had, but they didn't disregard it either. And if things kind of fell out the way that they thought they were going to, they accepted that, and they managed to sort of integrate these two sides of their minds, their two sides. And the second observation that he made that really struck me was that this was at least partly social. And Martin noticed that when people moved away from the Western Isles of Scotland, they would stop having these dreams or these visions. And if they moved back again, then they would return. The Premonitions Bureau was set up by a psychiatrist called John Barker in the 1960s. And Barker decided to set out to collect the dreams of the British public and to see if they could be used to prevent future disasters. Barker was a really fascinating person to write about. He was a divided soul. He had two parts to his mind and to his life, really. On the one hand, he was a rational, progressive doctor. He had a serious job. He was the deputy superintendent of a large mental hospital outside Shrewsbury. He was on the side of reform during the 1960s, taking the locks off the doors, discharging long-stay patients. But on the other hand, he was a child of the first half of the 20th century. He kept a crystal ball on his desk. He went ghost hunting on the weekends. And Barker's idea was to try and collect people's premonitions and dreams on a sufficient scale that you'd be able to feed them into a computer, and that a computer would look for peaks and patterns in the information. And if you collected these things in sufficient numbers, then maybe you could send out a kind of an official early warning of a kind of looming plane crash or a rail disaster. It was a kind of a voice of warning from the kind of collective subconscious. It's a really, really nutty experiment, and it didn't go very well. I won't give away the ending, but I will give away the twist, which is that kind of part the way through the experiment, two of Barker's most trusted percipients, as he called them, warned him that he was going to die. I worked on the book for a long time, and sometimes I would sort of lose confidence, and I'd wonder why I was writing it and why I was researching it. In many ways, it's a curious, slightly macabre story. But just when I was sort of feeling kind of low, I guess, I would stumble on an idea that would suggest that maybe what I was writing about wasn't totally marginal and strange, but was maybe connected to sort of more universal ways of thinking. And I thought I'd just talk about, just a couple of those ideas. And the first is an idea called, is a sort of a concept called the predictive brain, which has become increasingly important among neuroscientists since the 1990s. I'll kind of butcher it now, but the sort of the basic idea is that it sort of more or less overturns the classical model of perception. And what I mean by that is that we don't just, if you like, passively receive experiences as they happen to us. In fact, as soon as we think that something's about to happen, our brain fires up all our memories, our education, our kind of learning, what neuroscientists call our priors, to go and kind of meet this experience as it happens to us. So to sort of give a really kind of banal example, if I touch my finger to the palm of my hand, there's not a kind of signal that sort of travels up my arm and tells my brain that this is happening. I've probably touched my finger to my palm so many times that in fact, the only information that goes to my brain is the difference between what I'm expecting to happen and what actually does happen. It's the gap between what I think is about to occur and what actually does. People call these the prediction error. It's very kind of, and in the case of kind of touching my finger to my palm, I've probably done it so many times that there might be no information at all going to my brain. And so when you get your head around the predictive brain, you realize it's a much more efficient way of moving through the world, taking kind of partial pieces of information and intuitions. It's not a kind of a magical or a strange kind of activity. It's actually much more closely related to how we survive. And then there's that second idea of Martin's, which is about the idea of community and a shared way of thinking. Again, I don't think it's the kind of the first thing that you think about when people talk about premonitions. You might think about Mystic Meg or something like that. But actually the idea that you can see what's about to happen to me before it does, it suggests a shared consciousness. And Barker, like lots of other kind of mid-century British intellectuals, was kind of profoundly influenced by the work of Carl Jung. And I think at that time there was a real yearning for shared experience and the idea that societies could be joined in ways that people couldn't see or fully understand. So when I was writing the book, I was often imagined the Premonitions Bureau a bit like a Hebridean island, writing about a kind of a time and a place where a small group of people believed that they could see the future. And another idea that sort of has come up is the idea that we're more likely to see connections and see patterns which might not necessarily be there at times of stress. There's a really nice phrase, which is perceptual hunger, kind of a hunger to see information which might not be there. It's kind of coined by a student of Ivan Pavlov. And there was a nice experiment in the late 1970s where some researchers at the Institute of Higher Nervous Activity and Neurophysiology in Moscow showed some slides to some people who were about to jump out of an aeroplane. And these slides, they were sort of jumbles of dots, and inside the dots there were some numbers, but some of them were just kind of jumbles. And they showed them to these parachutists, and they found that they were best at spotting the hidden numbers when they were sort of on the runway and the plane was about to take off and they were full of adrenaline and ready to go. And they were most likely to see numbers that weren't there just when they jumped out of the plane. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the kind of the two great periods of sort of paranormal research in the 20th century in Britain were around the First World War, time of kind of dramatic social and technological change and horror. And in the 1960s, when Barker was setting up the Premonitions Bureau. It's another time of kind of dramatic social and technological change, kind of haunted by the possibility of nuclear war. And I kind of don't think it's beyond the realm of reason to think that we might be living through one of those times now. One of the things that people kind of ask me is what would a contemporary Premonitions Bureau look like? And when they ask me that, I think about a guy called Teilhard de Chardin. And de Chardin was a French Jesuit priest and a paleontologist and an evolutionary thinker. He was really, really deep. If you haven't read de Chardin, I encourage you to kind of get out there and be confounded by his ideas. But he thought that we were still evolving, that humans were evolving, and the next kind of logical stage of our evolution was a shared global consciousness. And he called this the Omega point. And it was a hopeful vision of a shared global consciousness. The idea that we would become more caring and more empathetic and more able to consider our kind of shared future, to be more humane to one another. And one of the things I love about the Premonitions Bureau is that on the one hand, it's pretty mad, but on the other hand, the idea of kind of pouring all our dreams and our anxieties into computers and searching for patterns in them, it really strongly resembles social networks and the internet and how we think today. And it's really easy to see the sort of the dark side of that. But I also kind of, part of me sort of hopes that maybe there's a positive side of a kind of a shared global consciousness, and we just haven't been able to see it yet. Those are my thoughts. Thank you, Rosie.
Sam, thank you so much. I really like that idea that we could have a global consciousness that could actually do all the things that we need to do. And as Lucy said, be kinder to planet Earth. That was a fantastic talk and really interesting. And your book is terrific, by the way. I absolutely loved it. I can't urge you all strongly enough to buy all our speakers' books tonight. And I'd just like to say thank you very, very much to all of them, to Sam, to Lucy, to Katy, to Jack, and to Philip. You've been amazing, and you've given us all an absolutely fantastic time. Next Monday, we have Tom Mustle, who for anyone who watches YouTube, you may remember he was the guy whose small canoe got upended by a whale off the coast of California. It was watched about a gazillion times online, and he's now written a book called How to Speak Whale, and he will be in conversation with the wonderful Lucy Jones, who wrote Losing Eden, who's been on 5x15 several times before. So do join us then. For everybody who joins us on Catch Up or on the podcast on YouTube, big welcome and enjoy tonight. You will have a lovely time. And to all of you at home, thank you so much for joining us, and good night, and see you all soon. Bye-bye.